Hello, welcome back to Beanwriting. Today, I'm looking at ethnicity, monstrosity, and the Gothic gaze, how horror and the weird have historically shaped ideas about blackness, and how writers, especially white writers, can engage those histories responsibly. But it's an immense subject, and as with everything, when you're writing outside of your cultural capital, you have to do your due diligence. You have to do your research. You cannot get informed from a 10 or 15 minute video. It's offensive to try and distill an entire people or peoples into quarter of an hour. So the Gothic gaze is a kind of mirror. It's dark, distorted, and deeply, deeply political. It doesn't just show us what we fear, it shows and reveals who we fear and why we fear them. For centuries, the Gothic imagination hasn't merely been a space of ghosts and curses. It's been a stage for racial anxieties. The monstrous was often imagined through the other. Skin, language, movement, or magic marked as foreign and therefore frightening. But horror also offers a chance to dismantle those myths, to reclaim the monstrosity as a tool for truth. This video will explore how race and empire shaped the Gothic imagination, how the black body was written as both invisible and hypervisible, why writers must decenter whiteness without centering guilt, and how black creators, from Tade Thompson to Eden Royce to Fela Kuti, have redefined what it means to haunt and be haunted. It might sound strange to question the idea of othering in horror or weird fiction. After all, the other is central to both genres. But let's be clear, the other is not the same as othering. To explore the other is to ask what frightens us. To other is to turn that fear into hierarchy. Another point before we begin, I'll be using the term race differently than ethnicity. Race is a construct, one historically built by white colonial powers to legitimize exploitation, violence, and genocide. I use it here not as a marker of identity, but as a reference to racism itself, a white invention and practice. It's important to make my position clear, because the Gothic has always carried its own internal prejudices, and those leanings are directly tied to the history of ethnicity and the creation of race. So, with that said, let's begin. The Gothic emerged in the late 18th century, the same century that mapped the world, measured skulls, and called its theft civilization. While castles crumbled in Europe's imagination, empires expanded abroad. Those two landscapes, the ruined manor and the colonized world, are inextricably linked. In novels like Frankenstein or Dracula, we see Europe's obsession with purity, borders, contagion and control. The monster and the foreigner were often interchangeable. As Toni Morrison writes in Playing in the Dark, Africanism is the vehicle by which the American self knows itself as not enslaved, but free, not repulsive, but desirable. A perversion of that same vehicle powered Gothic fiction. The dark other became a screen onto which white societies projected their buried guilt and fascination. Think of how Mary Shelley's creature is described. Yellow skin, watery eyes, black lips. He's assembled, just as racial science attempted to assemble hierarchies of humanity. The Gothic gaze, then, is an imperial gaze. It looks, categorizes, consumes. And horror, born in the same century as the slave ship and the scientific museum, learned to make spectacle of the body. Horror still carries the ghosts of those early narratives. There's the voodoo curse story, the white protagonist violated by a dark ritual they never understood. The jungle temple, haunted by nameless natives. The primitive idol brought home to Europe that exacts revenge. These aren't just outdated, they're colonial cosmologies disguised as fiction. They tell readers that blackness, Africanness, or Creole spirituality exists only as a threat, or at best a curiosity. They fetishize the other, whilst denying its voice. Even in modern cinema, we see this. Things like the African mask in a suburban attic, or the tribal drums that underscore menace. They replicate the museum's logic, displaying cultures behind glass, drained of context, the cultural kidnap without a ransom by white supremacy. When white writers use these symbols without grounding, they don't write horror, they reenact anthropology. Frantz Fanon warns the reader in Black Skin, White Masks. The black man is not a man, he is a symbol, and it is white men who have made him so. To write responsibly in horror, then, we have to break that symbolism. We have to stop making the black body serve as shorthand for the uncanny. It's great to see James Baldwin interviews so widely shared on social media platforms. I encourage other white authors, or better still white people in general, to seek him out. Similarly, I'd recommend Jane Elliott, who has contributed hugely to the discussion of hegemony and racism. Familiarizing yourself with both these people's large bodies of work will give you a clearer empathy and grasp of what it was, and sadly is, to be a black person living in a systemically racist society. Many white writers freeze when confronting ethnicity. They fear getting it wrong, so they write around it, or worse, apologize with empty platitudes within their text. Decentering whiteness is not about guilt, it's about gravity. Whiteness should not be the gravitational center of every story. Bell Hooks wrote, "There is power in looking. The gaze has been and is a site of resistance for colonized black people." So, if you're a white writer, the goal isn't to make whiteness disappear, but to question its position as the default observer, the default reader. This is where the concept of proximity, not possession, becomes vital. You don't need to own another story to understand the systems that shaped it. Get close enough to research, listen, learn, then create work that acknowledges the gaze rather than perpetuates it. And as Fela Kuti once said, music is the weapon of the future. Art, like music, can expose the violence of silence. When you write horror that acknowledges ethnicity, you turn that weapon into illumination. You let the alleged monster speak back. To understand blackness in Gothic and horror contexts, you've got to understand transnationality. And that is the flow of people, ideas, and trauma across the oceans, the diaspora. The Black Atlantic, as theorized by Paul Gilroy, describes this sort of cultural continuum, where African, Caribbean, and diaspora identities overlap and evolve beyond national boundaries. In 2004, I was lucky enough to attend a lecture in Atlanta by Dr. Mindy Thompson-Fullilove when doing a book tour for her Root Shock, How Tearing Up City Neighborhoods Hurts America and What We Can Do About It. It's another text I'd highly recommend, particularly for non-North American writers. It deals with the way black people have been forcefully moved around geographically, especially racialized dispossession and social stratification along racial lines. The horror of displacement becomes its own Gothic structure. Ghosts of ships, songs sung in code, ancestral memory carried through rhythm. In the UK, this became vivid through the Windrush generation, Caribbean migrants invited between 1948 and 1971 to rebuild post-war Britain. They arrived with skills and hope, but were met with suspicion and racism. So you can see, the haunted house of British Gothic is not just metaphorical, it's historical. It's the country house whose wealth was built on slavery, now occupied by descendants of those once enslaved. Writers of the diaspora have reclaimed those architectures. Eden Royce, in Root Magic, weaves Gullah-Geechee heritage into a Southern Gothic where ancestral spirits are protectors, not threats. Tade Thompson, in Rosewater, transforms Nigeria into a speculative frontier of alien contact, rewriting Western colonial tropes through African futurism. And even musicians like Fela Kuti, who I mentioned before, transformed horror into protest, turning the grotesque absurdities of dictatorship into Afrobeat exorcisms. We're reminded that the Gothic mansion has more than one story. Each of those artists I just mentioned does the same thing. They make the colonial gaze blink. Racism and ethnicity never stand alone. Intersectionality, a phrase coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, describes how ethnicity, gender, class, and sexuality interlock to shape oppression. In horror, this means recognizing how black women and queer people are often doubly othered, oppressed both by racism and by patriarchy. In early literature, black women were often portrayed as dangerous, exotic, or hypersexual. Tituba in The Crucible is a prime example, not a character but a vessel for white hysteria. Contrast that with Eden Royce's heroines, who claim power through tenderness and family, or N.K. Jemison's protagonists, who weaponize survival itself. Here, monstrosity becomes self-possession. Likewise, Tade Thompson, author of the aforementioned Rosewater, presents characters whose blackness coexists naturally within speculative settings, not as plot devices, but as dimensions of humanity. When horror embraces intersectionality, it stops performing fear of the other and starts exposing fear of power. Because power, not darkness, is what the Gothic has always hidden. And remember what I said at the beginning. Race relates to a power dynamic created by white colonists and does not speak to ethnicity, but a white methodology to justify, for example, 400 to 500 years of converting humans into cotton, tobacco, and sugar. So, when using the term racism, you've got to be aware that unless your point of view character is ignorant, non-white characters cannot be racist. They can only experience it. Don't mistake racism for prejudice and bigotry. Racism includes those, but it's larger than that. So, what does ethical, informed horror look like? Here are some guiding principles drawn from black scholars and creators. Number 1, don't use culture as costume. If you invoke spiritual or religious practices, Santeria, Voodoo, Ifa, Obia, treat them with scholarship, not spectacle. 2, avoid binary metaphors. Darkness isn't evil, whiteness isn't purity. These symbols carry a colonial residue. 3, read beyond Europe or your cultural capital. Study African, Caribbean, and diaspora horror. Rosewater, Root Magic, The Ballad of Black Tom, Things We Lost in the Fire, Native Son, Moses, Citizen and Me, The Famished Road. Number 4, interrogate your own gaze. Who are you centering? Who narrates the fear? Who gets to survive? Number 5, remember, monstrosity is systemic. The monster is rarely the marginalized figure. It's the structure that makes them marginal. Finally, 6, listen before you write. Art is an act of witness, so you have to research, collaborate, and make sure you give credit. So to close, the Gothic was never neutral. Its shadows are cast by empire, class, and history. But horror can evolve, and it is evolving. The contemporary Black Gothic doesn't ask to be let into the old mansion. It builds new architecture, made of rhythm, rebellion, and memory. Fela Kuti once said that Afrobeat was the weapon of the future. In literature, that weapon is awareness. When you confront history's ghosts with clarity, you open up the possibility to transform horror into resistance. And God knows we need that now more than ever as we watch entitled, privileged white men give voice to a new fascist agenda. So, if you're a white writer, don't fear the subject of racism or ethnicity. Fear ignorance, fear laziness, fear the comfort of thinking you're outside the story. Because, as every Gothic writer knows, the monster always comes home.